Book 4. The Structure of Shadanakar, the Infraphysical Planes. Chapter 2. The Worlds of Retribution. During the prehistoric era, the demonic powers were occupied with slowing human development and preparing the planes of transphysical magma and the core to receive millions of human souls in the future. Later, during historical times, the Shrasters and Witzrauer Sakwalas were created. Most purgatories appeared even later. Demons. The higher humankind of Shadanakar, who abide in a Sakwala of four-dimensional worlds with differing numbers of time streams. Demons proceed along a path of growth similar to ours. But they began much earlier and are completing it with greater success. They are linked to our humanity by a variety of threads, some of which are described in the main text. Shadanakar, the proper name of the Brahmapatra of our planet. It comprises a huge, more than 240 number of variomaterial planes of varying dimensions and time streams. Sakwala. Here it means a system of two or more variomaterial planes closely connected in structure and meta-history. Brahmapatra. Almost every heavenly body possesses a number of variomaterial planes that together form a closely integrated system. These systems, united by the commonality of processes taking place on their planes, are called Brahmapatras. In the majority of Brahmapatras in our galaxy, the chief process uniting the planes of each is the struggle between the providential and the demonic forces. There are, however, Brahmapatras that have completely fallen under the sway of the demonic, and those that have freed themselves entirely of it. Metahistory, the sum of processes, as yet outside the field of vision and methodology of science, that take place on planes of variobeing existing in other time streams and dimensions, and that are sometimes visible through the process we perceive as history and the religious teaching about those processes. Witzrauers, powerful, intelligent, and extremely predatory beings that abide on planes adjacent to the Shrasters. From the human point of view, they are demons of state power. There are very few of them. Witzrauers play a colossal, conflicting, and double-edged role in metahistory. Shrasters, variodimensional material worlds connected with areas within the physical body of the Earth known as countervailing prominences, which point to the center of the planet. The abode of anti-humankind, which is composed of two races, Igvas and Rarugs. There are great metropolises in the Shrasters and a very advanced demonic technology. Igvas, the principal race of anti-humankind. It is made up of highly intelligent demonic beings who abide in the Shrasters, the underside of the world. Rarugs, the second race of anti-humankind, into which the great predators of prehistoric times developed after countless incarnations on the planes of demonic materiality. Our survey of the worlds of retribution begins with the purgatories, because they are closer to us than the other planes. They are more commensurate with our customary notions, and in the case of a descent after death, it is in the purgatories that the descent begins. In the majority of cases, it ends there as well. The word purgatory is borrowed from Catholicism, but many of the Catholic beliefs invested in it do not coincide with the overall picture of what is to be described. The term Sheol could also have been used in reference to those planes, but the Judaic images of those shadowy lands of the dead will also find no parallel in my description. The purgatories of the various metacultures differ somewhat from each other. Taken separately, each of them also undergoes substantial changes over the course of centuries. In addition, they took shape in different historical periods. There were none at all in the metacultures of antiquity, including the Byzantine metaculture. To be more precise, worlds of eternal suffering existed in their place, and a distinct echo of mystical knowledge about planes of eternal suffering can be heard in most ancient religions. The oldest of the purgatories belongs to the Indian metaculture. It was the Indian synclite that first attained the power of light necessary to prevent Gogtunger's forces from turning into planes of torment, their sakwala of afterlife atonement, a sakwala that the Indian metaculture had inherited from the demons and titans, the most ancient of humankind. Later, some planes in the metacultures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were converted into purgatories. The key role in that was played by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his descent into the demonic worlds, and the struggle that ensued over several centuries between the Christian synclites and the demons over mitigation of the law of retribution. But the struggle did not end in victory in the Byzantine metaculture. The enemy camp offered stubborn resistance. As a result, the Byzantine metaculture broke away from Enroth. Gogtunger, the name of the planetary demon of our Brahmfatura. He is three persons in one, like certain other beings among the uppermost hierarchies. The first hypostasis of Gogtunger is Gisturg, the great torturer. The second is Fokerma, the great harlot. And the third is Urparp, the great implementer of the demonic plan, who is sometimes called the principle of form. Hierarchy, used in this book in two senses. 1. A series of subordinate ranks, whether they be ecclesiastical, military, or administrative. And 2. Different categories of varianatural, variomaterial, or spiritual beings, for example, the angelic, demonic, elemental, or demonic hierarchies. Synclites, the hosts of enlightened human souls that abide in the Zatomis of metacultures. Zatomis, the highest planes of human metacultures, their heavenly lands, the bulwark of the demiurges and national guiding spirits, and the abodes of the synclites. Together with Aramoya, the Zatomis of the rows of the world now under construction, they are 34 in number. Metaculture, the inner sakwalas of Shadanakar, which take the form of multi-planed segments, as it were. Metacultures are composed of varying numbers of planes, but each has at least 3 specific planes. The physical plane, the abode of the corresponding superpeople in Enroth that create the culture. The Zatomis, the heavenly land of enlightened souls of the people. And the Shraster, the demonic underworld that counterposes the Zatomis. In addition, every metaculture includes one or another number of planes of enlightenment and retribution. The nature of these worlds varies between metacultures in accordance with the course metahistory takes in each. Aramoya, the Zatomis of global culture, currently under construction. Rose of the world, the future Christian church of the final centuries, which will reunite within itself the Christian churches of the past, and will be joined on the basis of a free amalgamation with all religions of light. It is in this sense that the rose of the world is interreligious or panreligious. Its principal task is to save as many human souls as possible and help them avert the danger of being spiritually enslaved by the future anti-God. The birth of the rose of the world among humanity will be a reflection of the ether birth of Sventa in one of the Zatomis. Supra-people, a group of nations or ethnic groups united by a common, jointly created culture. Enroth, the name of our physical plane, a concept synonymous with what astronomy calls the universe. It is characterized by 3 dimensions of space and 1 time stream. Sventa, a great God-born monad, an expression of eternal femininity. the bride of the planetary Logos. She descended from the heights of the spiritual cosmos to the upper plains of Shadanakar approximately 150 years ago, and is destined to assume an enlightened, and not physical, incarnation in one of the Zatomis of humanity. That meta-historical event will be reflected in terrestrial Enroth, in the birth of the Rose of the World. Planetary Logos, a great God-born Munad, the expression of God the Sun, the divine mind of our Brahmvatura, the oldest and first of its monads. He expressed himself in humanity as Jesus Christ and is overseeing preparations for the turn of the Eon. The planetary Logos is the leader of all the forces of light in Shadanakar. Monad. Here the term means a primal, indivisible, immortal spiritual entity, which can be either God-created or God-born. The universe is composed of a countless number of monads and of the numerous kinds of materiality created by them. I mentioned in passing before the implications of the Byzantine Orthodox Church's refusal to embrace the idea of purgatories when it arose in the Western Church. The horrifying prospect of the eternal torments awaiting the soul of a sinner should be regarded as the impulse for the extreme asceticism with which the Byzantine religious spirit burned to the very end of its history. Yes, the eschatological depths, with all the extremes of their demonic cruelty, unfolded before the eyes of Byzantine prophets. One can only be surprised not by the desperate ascetic excesses of that culture, but by the fact that such excesses did not occur in all the metacultures that lack purgatories. The first Sheol in the Russian metaculture was created in the 12th century, after having been converted from a plane of torment through the efforts of Christ. Its appearance has changed somewhat over time, and the karmic weights that draw the dead down into that world have changed as well. Be that as it may, the mechanics of the law of retribution have, of course, remained always and everywhere the same. It dictates that a violation of moral laws encumbers the ether body of the perpetrator. While such a person is still alive, the encumbered ether body remains afloat, as it were, on the surface of the three-dimensional world, with the physical body playing the role of life preserver. But as soon as that person's link is severed by death, the ether body begins to sink deeper and deeper, from plane to plane, until it reaches equilibrium with its surroundings. Ether body, the third of the subtle coatings of an incarnating monad. No organic life is possible in 3- and 4-dimensional worlds without it. These are the basic mechanics, but there are also beings who oversee its smooth operation, the enforcers of karma. Among the various demons of Shadanakar, they are a class unto themselves. They are newcomers. When the demonic hordes of the planet Daya were expelled to the Brahmvatura of its moon, and the moon soon after broke up into a mass of dead fragments, asteroids, its demonic inhabitants scattered into space in search of a new haven. A group of them entered Shadanakar after concluding a sort of pact with Gogtungar's forces. They are beings of superior intellect, but emotionally they are as cold as ice. They know neither hate nor love, malice nor compassion. They assumed supervision of the mechanics of karma, replenishing their energy with emanations from the mental suffering of people who have been forced to descend to Scrivnus, Ladref, and Morad, the upper planes of the purgatories, after their life in Enroth. The enforcers of karma are immense in size. They are as translucent and gray as frosted glass. Their bodies are rectangular, and strangely enough, their faces somewhat resemble those of guard dogs. Pointy ears and alert eyes. They enter into battle with the forces of light only when those forces undertake to mitigate the laws of karma and to transform purgatories. Scrivnus, the uppermost of the purgatories of Christian metacultures. There are analogous planes in other metacultures as well. Every soul, except those that enter Olirna directly after death and continue up through the worlds of enlightenment, invariably descends to Scrivnus after death. The first of the purgatories is called Scrivnus. It is the very picture of a stark, godless world and society. A colorless landscape, a leaden gray sea that is always calm. Withered grass, stunted bushes, and moss call to mind our tundra. But at least in the spring, the tundra is covered with flowers. Not a single flower has sprouted from the soil of Scrivnus. Hollows surrounded by short but unscalable slopes serve as the dwelling places of the millions who were once people. Scrivnus knows neither love, nor hope, nor joy, nor religion, nor art. Nor has it ever seen children. Interminable labor is interrupted only by sleep, but the sleep is without dreams, and the labor is without creativity. Huge, frightful beings keep watch on the other side of the slopes. From time to time, they toss out piles of objects that seem to float through the air. On its own, each object finds the one who is to work on it. Mending old clothes no one needs. Washing things that look like bottles caked in grease and dirt. Stripping pieces of broken metal. Both work and sleep take place primarily in long barracks, sectioned off inside by waste partitions. The inhabitants fully retain their human appearance, but their facial features are smudged and flattened. They remind one of identical-looking pancakes. Be that as it may, the memory of life in Enroth is not only preserved in the hearts of the inhabitants, it gnaws at them like the dream of paradise lost. The most relentless of the torments of Scrivnus is the weariness of interminable slavery, the tedium of the labor, and the absence of any hope for the future. It is not a hopeful prospect, but the nightmare of an ever-present threat that offers the only seemingly realistic way out of that place. A black, box-like ship appears on the sea and quickly and noiselessly glides into shore. Its sighting sends the inhabitants into a horrified panic, since none of them can be sure that they will not be swallowed up in the pitch black of the ship's hold. Having rounded up a number of them, they, whose karmic weight condemns them to suffer on deeper planes, the ship casts off. Those confined in the hold do not see the route being taken. They only sense their horizontal motion giving way to a spiraling descent, as if the ship were being sucked into a whirling maelstrom. Scrivnus is restricted to the expiatory suffering of those whose conscience has not been sullied by the memory of grave sins or crimes, but whose consciousness in Enroth was insulated from the will and influence of its Shelt by a thick wall of worldly cares and exclusively material concerns. The next plane resembles the previous one, but it is darker, as if it were suspended in nebulous murk on the edge of everlasting night. There are neither buildings nor crowds here. Everyone, however, is aware of the unseen proximity of a great many others. Tracks like footprints betray their presence. That purgatory is called Ladref, and tens of millions spend a brief time there. Descent to Ladref is the consequence of religious skepticism, which does not give spirituality the power to penetrate into a person's essence and lighten his or her ether body. Those doomed to further descent have the impression of falling asleep and then suddenly waking up in unfamiliar surroundings. In fact, demonic beings, as the enforcers of karma, transport them while they are in a stupor into a different time stream, though the number of dimensions 3 remains constant in all the Sheols. Those expiating their karma find themselves in a darkness where only the soil and sparse equivalents of vegetation emit a dim phosphorescent light. Glowing cliffs do lend a grim beauty to the landscape in places. That is the last plane with vestiges of what we group under the name nature. The planes that follow will consist solely of urban settings. In Morad, that next plane, absolute silence reigns. Everyone in that world is convinced they are utterly alone, there being no signs of any other inhabitants. An overpowering feeling of forsakenness encases them like a suit of armor. In vain do they scramble about, pray, call for help, or seek out others. All are left alone with their own soul. But their souls are corrupt. Their memories are sullied by the wrongs they did on earth. And there is nothing more frightening for such souls than solitude and quiet. There, everyone comes to a full realization of the meaning and repercussions of the wrongs they committed on earth, and drains the cup of horror their sins instill. Nothing distracts the unfortunates from that endless internal monologue, not even the struggle for survival. There is no struggle. There is food all around in abundance in the form of certain kinds of soil. As for clothing, in the majority of planes, Morad included, the ether body itself radiates a material coating, a coating for which clothes are a substitute in our world. And if, in the worlds of enlightenment, this coating is beautiful and radiant, the creative handicap of the inhabitants of Morad allows only for the creation of ether rags. In point of fact, the astral ether essence of those undergoing expiation was already clothed in such tatters back in Ladref. They, whose conscience Morad does not cleanse, can no longer expect a smooth passage into the next plane. Instead, they experience a sudden and terrifying plunge down into it. It is as if a quagmire opens up underneath the unfortunates and sucks them down. First their legs, then their bodies, and last their heads. Our survey of the purgatories has arrived at Agar, a plain of black vapors, where the dark mirror images of the great cities of Enroth dot the landscape like islands. Agar, like all the purgatories, does not extend into outer space, so neither sun nor stars nor moon can be seen there. The sky appears as a solid firmament wrapped in constant night. Some objects glow of themselves. The ground also emits a dull glow, as if it were saturated with blood. There is one dominant color there, but we in Enroth are unable to see it. It gives an impression close to dark crimson and might well be the color we know as infrared. I am only slightly acquainted with Infra-Petersburg. As I recall, it also has a large river, but it is as black as ink, and there are buildings that emit a blood-red glow. It could, in a way, be likened to the light given off by the fires on Vasilyevsky Island on national holidays. But it is a ghastly likeness. Those who have fallen into that world have retained their human features, but their bodies are deformed and repulsive. They are short in height, and their movements have slowed. Their bodies no longer radiate any kind of material substitute for clothes, and unrelieved nakedness reigns everywhere. One of the torments of Agar is a feeling of impotent shame and a constant awareness of one's own wretched state. The inhabitants are also tormented by the beginnings of a stinging pity for others like them, as it dawns on them that they share the blame for their tragic fate. A third torment afflicts the unfortunates: fear. It is instilled by Volgras. Demonic predators also present in Agar. When we came near the building that constitutes the dark ether body of the engineer's castle, I saw a huge creature, the size of a dinosaur, sitting motionless on its roof. It was a female, one droopy and flabby with gray, porous skin, forlornly pressing a cheek to the tower and hugging it with its right paw. The poor thing was staring blankly into the distance with what appeared to be empty eye sockets. It seemed very unhappy. I had the impression it desperately wanted to cry out or howl, but it had no mouth or orifice of any kind. To feel pity for it, however, was in itself very dangerous. The crafty predator was on the lookout for prey, and any who had been human were potential victims. The poor beings, wild with fear of the Volgras and hardly daring to breathe, were hiding behind corners or skulking at the base of the buildings the monsters had chosen to rest on. To be eaten, or rather, to be sucked in by a Volgra through its porous skin, is to die in Augur, but only to reappear even lower, in Bustvich or in horrible Rafag. I later learned that there were a great many Volgras, that they are to some degree intelligent, and that the primitive, dark civilization that characterizes Augur is their creation. They had virtually no mechanical devices to facilitate their labor. They erected the buildings that I saw all around by hand, using material similar to the trunks of California's giant redwoods. And every piece of that material, once it had been fixed to the other pieces, began to glow with a dull crimson light that illuminated virtually nothing. What connection exists between the buildings in the human cities of Enroth and the Volgras buildings in Augur remains a mystery to me. They have no oral language, of course, but they do use a kind of sign language. They must have built the buildings for shelter from the brief showers that poured down every few minutes. The rain was black. Also strange is the fact that Volgras have 3 sexes, not 2. The male impregnates the neuter, who carries the embryo for a period of time and then passes it on to the future mother. But here and there, silent buildings that do not glow at all dot the civilization like islands. The Volgras did not go anywhere near them. There must have been something I could not see that was hindering them. Such buildings stood on the sites of St. Isaac's Cathedral and certain other churches in St. Petersburg. They are the only refuge where the tormented of Augur can feel safe from the Volgras, if only for a short time. Who built them? When? Out of what? I do not know. Hunger did not permit the unfortunates to hide long in those shelters, but drove them out in search of the edible mold that grows on the base of buildings in that bleak city. If those who were human are not doomed by heavy karma to fall prey to a Volgra and come to in the next world of descent, then they are destined, sooner or later, to undergo a transformation that will lift them. The bodies of those nearing the completion of their atonement gradually begin to change. They grow in height. The facial features they used to have begin to form anew, and the Volgras do not dare go near them. The transformation itself takes place with the assistance of brothers and sisters from heavenly Russia. Descending to Augur, they surround the ones who have completed their ordeal. Only those others who themselves will soon be raised from there in the same way are allowed to be in attendance. While they watch from the wings, it seems to them that the members of the Synclite lift those freed onto their wings or into the folds of glittering sheets. The Volgras, gripped by mystic fear and trembling, watch from a distance, unable to understand what is happening. Heavenly Russia, Holy Russia, the Zatomis of the Russian metaculture and abodes of its Synclite. The staircase of ascent is not closed to a single demonic monad, not even to Volgras. But such a conversion requires a high level of consciousness, which is hardly ever in evidence there. Something completely different is sometimes in evidence there instead. The landscape is broken in places by glowing puddles that resemble small pools of waste. Something about the green in them is nauseating. It is Bustvich, the next lowest plane, visible through Augur. Everything there is rotting. but nothing decomposes completely. The sensation of rotting alive, combined with the spiritual lethargy, constitutes the torment of Bhustvich. They whose soul, encumbered by indulgence of unenlightened physical desires, did not fashion any kind of counterweight during life on earth, unravel the knots of their karma in Bhustvich. There the prisoner is gnawed at by an overpowering feeling of self-disgust because its ether body has taken the form of excrement. For, horrifying and revolting as it may be, Bhustvich is essentially nothing more than the Volgra's cesspool. Physical torments begin to commingle with mental ones. The prisoners are extremely restricted in their mobility and in their means of self-defense. But self-defense is of primary necessity for every one of them. For abiding with them there, between incarnations in one of the worlds of demonic elementals, are the souls of small, human-like demons coated in a dark ether body. They look like human worms and are about the size of cats. They eat alive those who at one time were humans in Enroth, and they do it slowly, a little at a time. Elementals, a category of God-created monads that proceed along a path of growth in Shadanakar, primarily through the realms of nature. In the majority of cases, however, they do not undergo physical incarnation. Since humanity is an aspect of one realm of nature, there are various groups of elementals linked not to the natural elements, in the broad sense of the word, but to the natural, elemental aspect of humanity. At that time, that is, in 1949, the Emperor Paul I was in that plane's twin copy of the engineer's castle. There is one in Bhustvich as well. He had already passed through a cycle of torments on deeper planes and was being slowly raised to Drokarg, the Shraster of Russian anti-human kind. I was astonished by the harshness of his fate. But it was explained to me that if the agony of his murder on the night of March 1st, 22nd, had not relieved him of a part of his karmic weight, and if instead he had continued to tyrannize the country right up until a death by natural causes, the weight of his crimes would have drawn him down even deeper, until he had reached Propulk, one of the most horrific of the planes of torment. Bhustvich is followed by the purgatory of Rafag, where the karmic consequences of betrayals and self-serving loyalty to tyrants are expunged. Rafag is the torment of constant affliction by debilitating illness of a sort that might find on our plane a distant parallel in cholera. Rafag is the last plane in which the landscape is even faintly reminiscent of our cities. But there are no shelters such as were scattered throughout Bhustvich and Agar. The mantle of humanity's prayers does not reach Rafag. Only the powers of the Synclites and upper hierarchies of Shadanakar can penetrate beyond it. Angels of darkness rule over the lowest three purgatories. Shim Big, the first of these planes, is a slow stream flowing through an inexpressibly oppressive world enclosed under a high vault. It is hard to tell what the source of its drab, colorless half-light is. A drizzle sprinkles on the stream, raising tiny bubbles on its surface. It is no longer the covering of the souls being tormented there, but the souls themselves, in their decomposed ether bodies that resemble wispy brown rags. They stumble back and forth, grabbing hold of whatever they can to keep from falling into the stream. It is not only fear that torments them. They are afflicted even more by a feeling of shame of unsurpassed intensity, and by a desperate longing for their real body and for the soft, warm world memories of the joys of life on earth. The feeling of pity also intensifies there. In the meantime, the mouth of the stream can be seen up ahead. The stream itself and the entire tunnel-shaped world breaks off just as a subway tunnel breaks off where a trestle begins. but the water does not fall anywhere. The water and the banks and the vault, everything, dissolves into a gray, featureless void. Nobody can exist there, and there is not even a hint of any ground or atmosphere. Only one thing does not disappear there: the spark of self-consciousness. In that purgatory, Drorn, the soul experiences the terrifying illusion of non-existence. In Shimbig, atonement is done by those who were responsible for a few human deaths, even the deaths of criminals. Whether by passing death sentences or by denouncing someone to the authorities. In Drum can be found those whose violation of the law would seem, in our view, incomparably lesser. The arithmetic of karma is strange indeed. What draws one down to Drum is not heinous crimes or bloodshed, but only the karmic consequences of a zealous atheism, an aggressive repudiation of spirituality, the active promotion of the false idea of the soul's mortality. The secret behind that surprising and seemingly disproportionate punishment is that those acts of will corked tight, as it were, the breathing holes of the soul while it was still in Enroth, resulting in an even greater encumbering of the ether essence than occurs even as the result of individual crimes taken separately. To prisoners of Drum, it appears that nothing exists anywhere, that they themselves do not exist just as they imagined it during their lives. Only after tremendous efforts taking up no brief span of time are they able to come to grips with the astonishing fact that, contrary to all reason and common sense, their conscious self does not disappear, even there, in the void. In so doing, they begin to understand, vaguely at first, that it could all have been very different if they had not chosen that non-existence, or semi-non-existence, themselves. But the misery of self-inflicted aloneness that colors their stay in Drum and begins to give way, little by little, to alarm. The self feels as if it is being drawn downward and to the side, and as if it is turning from a dot into an elongated body pointed downward. The absence of any points of reference prevents it from knowing whether it is falling slowly or descending at a rapid speed. The only orientation it has is an inner voice, which howls louder than any logical thought, that it is moving neither up nor horizontally, but down. Down below, an area of pink comes into view. For several seconds, the color may even appear inviting. But then, a blood-chilling guess takes hold of the unfortunate self. It realizes that it is falling helplessly into a calm sea of molten iron. It gains in weight, and it hits the molten red surface of Fukaburn, the last plane in the sequela of purgatories, and plunges deep down into it. Besides the burning sensation, the torment consists of a feeling of horror at descending into eternal torture, a descent that rings of finality. Commencing after Fukaburn is the Sakwala of transphysical magma. These circumscribed worlds coexist in three-dimensional space, though in different time streams, with belts of molten rock within the planet's crust. I would like to repeat and stress that, in all the metacultures, except the Indian, the suffering in those worlds was without end until Jesus Christ carried out his liberating descent into them, which in church tradition is called the descent of the Savior into the dead. From that moment on, it became possible, though only at the cost of tremendous efforts, for the forces of light to extricate sufferers from those abysses after the period of time necessary for them to unravel the knots of their personal karma. The first of the magmas is Okrus, the muddy bottom of Fukaburn. As far back as in Drum, the Schelt had been left without any of its old coatings and a new bodily essence had begun to form. Its formation nears completion in Okris, but it has nothing even remotely human about its appearance. It is a spherical object of animate inframetal. Who are the torments of Fukaburn and Okris for? There are actually few such sufferers. Millions suffered in Scrivus and Ladref, but hundreds, perhaps only dozens, suffer here. The condemnation of ideological enemies to horrible tortures. The condemnation of the innocent, the torment of the defenseless, the torture of children. That is what is expiated through suffering in Okrus and Fukaburn. There the tormented remember well the religious teachings and the warnings they were given on earth. They are sensible of bodily pain as retribution, but have already begun to recognize the dual nature of the law and the demonic, not divine, responsibility for its harshness. Their consciousness begins to waken. That is the providential side of the law, the ancient basis for it that was established by the demiurges back before Gogtungur's invasion of Shadanakar. The wakening of consciousness, the wakening of conscience, and the growth of spiritual thirst are those aspects of the law of retribution that the forces of light did not cede to the dark forces, and thanks to which the law, despite everything, has not become an absolute evil. In its infraphysical state, the magma is very similar to its physical counterpart. Prisoners there at first retain their freedom of movement, but there is as yet no need to make efforts to sustain their existence. They automatically absorb energy from their surroundings. The same is true of Gvager, the second belt of magma, a motionless lava sea. I would, however, like to remind the reader that suffering of any kind in Enroth alleviates torments in the afterlife, primarily by reducing their time span, but sometimes also through a change in their quality. On the whole, the length of a soul's expiatory punishments after death is determined by the number of the victims that suffered from its actions in Enroth. Mass crimes result in descent to a lower plane of retribution. For example, Urkarvire can take the place of Okris, or Propolk can take the place of Gveger. For the bodily suffering that began in Fukaburn and increased in Okris and Gveger reaches its zenith on the next plane, the seething magma of Urkarvire. There the corruptors of lofty and enlightened ideas, who bear the blame for warping the transphysical paths of thousands and millions, do atonement. Urkarvire likewise harbors those who are guilty of those heinous deeds known, in our dry, lifeless language, as conscious sadism. That is, not only did the criminals experience a feeling of pleasure from causing others suffering, but they were fully aware of the immorality of the pleasure at the time. They were aware, but that did not prevent them from enjoying it, nor from indulging in it time and again. Fortunately, time flows much more quickly there. For example, a world-famous writer of modern times, who was not guilty of conscious sadism, of course, but of corrupting ideals, of perverting ideas, and poisoning a great many minds with lies, had the impression that he had spent only a few days there, and not the 10 years it was in Enroth time. Next comes the hard magma of Propolk, the world of expiatory suffering for mass butchers, the instigators of bloody wars, and the torturers of entire peoples. All freedom of movement is lost. Their bodies feel as if they were lodged in a hard substance and pressed from all sides. But even this horrible bodily suffering is surpassed by the suffering of the soul. They feel a stinging remorse and longing for God that is impossible on any of the planes above it. Fortunately, few descend to Propolk. Need I say that Yezov or Beria's cohorts are there? Amazingly, only a short while ago, Malyuta Skuratov was still suffering there. In the prologue of the Western metacultures, not only Robespierre and Saint-Just, but even some of the 16th century inquisitors were still unraveling their karma. The magma Sakwala concludes with the super-heavy magma of Ural. The bodily suffering there is completely overshadowed by spiritual torment. Ural was created for the punishment of those who in our legal tongue are called repeat offenders. Those who, having once already fallen to the magma and returned to Enroth, again encumbered themselves with unspeakable crimes. The magmas end there. Below the magma begins the Sakwala of worlds corresponding to the planet's physical core, worlds common to all metacultures. First come the infrared caves of Biask, the direst of the red infernos, as we might designate the entire staircase of planes from Fukaburn down to Biask. There the body again metamorphoses, sprouting the semblance of a head and 4 limbs. But the gift of speech is lost, for there is no one with whom to converse. Each of the prisoners is held in solitary confinement and sees only his or her tormentors, who, strangely enough, resemble the devils of our legends. Sitting here in Enroth in relative security, we can afford to chuckle as much as we like about people believing in those horned villains. But do not wish even your sworn enemy a closer acquaintance with them. The victims who fall to Biask number at most in the dozens, but because there is a great throng of devils in need of their gavak, these devils wring gavak from their victims by every means they can devise. The victims of Biask are those who in Enroth were tempters of the spirit. Such crimes are judged so harshly because they do great karmic damage to thousands of human souls. Even butchers at whose hands hundreds of people have died physically do not do as much harm as those about whom it is said in the Gospels, "Whoever causes one of these little ones, who believe in me, to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened round his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea." Matthew 18:6. And even if Yaroslavsky or Bedny had been good people in their private lives, it would not have saved them from the fate that awaits tempters of the spirit in the afterlife. Beneath Biask gape the vertical cracks of Amintz. Those who fall there get snagged, as it were, and hang there completely helpless. And since the cracks lead down to Gash Sharva, the unfortunates find themselves hanging right over the lair of the demonic powers in Shadanakar. In Amiats are those who combined conscious sadism with an immensity of heinous deeds. But there are side tunnels leading from the vertical cracks of Amintz. They are Utrecht, the planetary night which will last until the end of our planet's existence in Enroth, that is, until the end of the second future eon. There have been very few there, Ivan the Terrible, for instance. Further, there is yet another, very special plane. Only this plane could be equal to the crime of Judas Iscariot. It is called Zursh. No one except Judas has ever entered it. It goes without saying that we do not have even the slightest inkling of the suffering experienced on the planes of the core. Our survey has now arrived at the graveyard of Shadanakar, the last of the planes. I could not make out its name clearly. Sometimes it sounded like Suil. Sometimes I thought it was closer to Suyetk. And the question has remained unresolved in my mind. Those who persist in doing evil descend there from the lower planes of torment. Their shells, what is left of them, are abandoned by their monads. The monads leave Shadanakar for good, to start anew in places, times, and forms beyond our conception. Yet that is still better than falling through the pit of Shadanakar into the pit of the galaxy. At least in the former case, the monad does not leave cosmic time. But the Shelt is alive. It is a conscious, albeit lesser, self It is barely stirring in Sufetk as the last of its energy expires, little by little. It is that same second death mentioned in the Holy Scriptures. A spark of consciousness flickers to the end, and the magnitude of its suffering surpasses even the imagination of the demons themselves. To this day, no one of light, not even the planetary Logos, has been able to penetrate into Sufetk. It is sometimes visible to members of the Synclites, but from neighboring planes, not from within. At those times they can make out a desert, over which glows the dim purple sun of Gash-Sharba, Gogtunger's anticosmos. Gash-Sharba, one of the principal planes in the demonic anticosmos of Shadanakar, a two-dimensional world where a variety of powerful demonic beings abide. Anticosmos, provisional designation of all those worlds created by the demonic to supersede the divine cosmos. At present, the anticosmos of our Brahmfatura consists of the planes of Shog, Digm, Gash-Sharba, Sufetk, and the Pit. Digm, the abode of Gogtunger, one of the five-dimensional worlds with an abundance of time streams. Fortunately, in the entire history of humanity, the total number of monads that have fallen to Sufetk does not exceed a few hundred. Of them, only a few have left any trace in history. For all the prominent chronically descending monads are brought to Gash-Sharba. Those for whom even Gogtunger has no use go to Sufetk. I know of only one historical figure among them, Domitian, who in the incarnation following his fall to Propolk became Marshal Gilles de Retz, the one who at first was a comrade in arms of Joan of Arc, but was later a villain and sadist, who bathed in tubs made from the innards of children he had murdered. Cast down to Iril, he soiled himself again in his next incarnation in Enroth, with atrocities committed during the Inquisition. After his third death, he sliced through all the planes of the Inferno for the third time, reached Sufetk, and was ejected from Shadanakar like slag. I know full well that the humanitarian spirit of our age would prefer to be presented with a very different picture from the one I have described in this chapter. Some will find it objectionable that, departures notwithstanding, my testimony seems to resemble too closely traditional images from historical Christianity. Others will be shocked by the savagery of the laws and by the bodily character of the horrible agonies endured on the plains of torment. But I am prepared to ask of the former, did you seriously think that the teachings of the Fathers of the Church were based on nothing but figments of a spooked imagination? Only a mind as empty of spirit as a tractor or a rolling mill could suppose, for example, that we can reduce the Divine Comedy to a collection of artistic techniques, political diatribe, and poetic fantasy. In the first part of his book, Dante revealed the staircase of infraphysical planes extant in the Roman Catholic metaculture in the Middle Ages. One must learn to separate the impurities introduced into the picture to satisfy artistic demands, or as the result of aberrations inherent to the age from the expression of genuine, unparalleled, and staggering transphysical revelation. And I do not consider it out of place to mention that the one who was Dante now numbers among the few great human spirits that have it within their power to penetrate unhindered down to the very pit of Shadanakar. As for those who are upset at the severity of the laws, I have only one thing to say: work to enlighten them. Of course, it would be easier to sell the intellectual mindset of the humanitarian age through an image of so-called spiritual rather than physical torments, pangs of conscience, despair over the inability to love, and the like. Unfortunately, these barbaric laws were clearly established without consideration for the sentiments of the 20th century intelligentsia. It is true that spiritual suffering also plays a large role in the planes of descent, Essentially, only the great criminals of history are primarily subjected to bodily suffering, suffering that is, in addition, worse than any physical pain of ours, because ether pain surpasses the physical both in intensity and length. But we could also ask, given the amount of pain these people caused their victims in Enroth, what pangs of conscience, or, as Dostoevsky thought, despair at not being able to love, could counterbalance that mountain of suffering on the scales of the impartial law of karma? And each of us is free to join those who are working to mitigate that law. Thank you for listening. Why not to subscribe for more?